Okay, let's go ahead and start writing our very own karate test now against the BasicTodos application. So back here in the IDE, I'm going to use this examples folder, but I'm going to create another folder in the examples folder, and then let's just call it to-dos, just to represent our to-dos application. And then right click on that new folder, and then let's create a new file called todos.feature. So we can see here when we create a feature class in our IDE, because we installed that plugin, because we installed the karate plugin here, it actually auto populates us with the feature and the scenario keyword for us straight away. So the feature file, that's basically what we're going to use to group together lots of different test scenarios. So for us here, let's just give our feature file a name. So let's just call it karate basic to-dos. For our scenario, this is where we actually need to define the tests, so we define the test steps. So first we need to give our scenario a name. So let's just call this one get all to-dos. And now in our scenario, we actually need to define the steps to make our API test. So again, we use the given when then syntax. So the idea is that you say given something, that does the setup of the test. The when part is then the actual execution of the test. And then the then part at the end, that's where you do the assertion or the check on the test just to make sure that the check completed. Let's write out some code just to have a look at an example of that. So we write the given keyword here. And what we need to do is we need to put in a URL. And this is where we put in the URL of our API, basically. So our API lives at HTTP. It's running on localhost, running on port 8000. Oh, sorry, I think it's running on port 8080, not 8000. And our endpoint is API/todos. Okay, so now I need to do when method get. So with this, which means we just want to make a get call to this endpoint. And then we want to check that the status that we get back, we just want to make sure that we get a 200 back. A 200 response code status basically just means that the API call worked okay. I'll just make sure that I save this file with Command S. And now we're ready to go ahead and run this API test. So to do that, I can just click run on here if I had the karate plugin installed. But because I don't have a subscription for the plugin, we actually need to run the tests in a different way. So to do that, I'm going to open up a terminal. And in the terminal, all I can do is just type mvn clean test to just run the test through Maven instead. So we can see here that the test has run through okay. And if we look at the logs here, we can see that all of the tests have passed. All of our one test, even though we've only got one test, that's passed successfully. We can also see here the response that we're getting back from the API. So this looks similar to what we looked at in Postman again. We can see that we're getting this 200 response back when we're calling the API. So let's just check that it works. So what about instead if I was looking for a 202 status? Let me save that and then run the test again. And this time the test fails. And it fails because it was expecting a 200 response code, but it expected a 202 response code, but it got back a 200, which is what we would expect. So that's good. Let's change that back to a 200 like so. Let me close down the terminal. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and start writing some more tests, shall we? So I'm going to create a second scenario here. And this one I'm just going to call basic to do flow. So let's start writing some karate tests in here. So let's start writing some karate tests in here. So I'm just going to add a comment in here just so I know which test that I'm writing, which test I'm referring to in the code. Let's call this one just create a single to do. So in order to create a to do, this time we need to make a post call. We need to make a post call to our API, and that will create a new to do in our application for us. So normally what we would have to do before is that we would have to specify the URL, but I don't really want to have to keep specifying the URL in every scenario that I run. There must be a better way to do that, and of course there is. So to do that, what we can do is we can add in a background block. And basically the code in the background block, this will get run before every single scenario. So what I can do here is I can just define the URL, and I can define that by saying star URL and then just put the URL in there like so. So now I don't need to specify the URL each time because I put it in the background. I actually only need to set it once, and that will get set automatically in all of the scenarios. Now this star here, what this just does in karate, this is just a special word that replaces either given, when, or then. So actually all of these given when thens, I could actually replace all of these just with a star. We just leave them in our scenarios just because it makes our scenario a little bit more readable. But in the background block, I can just put star to define the URL instead. I don't have to put given, when, or then. So let's carry on with creating our post call to create a single to do. So for this one, we need to send a request body. So similarly to like we did when we looked through Postman, what we can say is given request. And here we just need to put in a JSON blob, which is just a post request that we're going to send to our API. So our request body is going to look like this very simple JSON blob. It's just going to have a title of first, and it's just going to have a complete status of false. So this is the JSON that we're going to send up to our API. We then do when method. This time we do a post. So last time we did a get call. This time we're going to do a post. Let's also check again that the status that we get back from the API is a 200. Okay, that looks good. I think we can just go ahead and run this just to make sure that it's working. So I'm going to open up my terminal again and again do Maven clean test. And we get a build success message back. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to open up the application. We can see here that our first task has actually been created when we made that API call. So if I was to just run this again a second time, that should trigger again the same call, this call here that's going to create a new task. If I go back over to the application again, refresh, and now we've got 2 of the tasks. So we know that these API calls are working, that they're creating tasks for us. So at the moment we're just checking on the response code, we're just checking that we're getting a 200, but what we can actually do is we can actually check some more of the content of what we're getting back from when we're making that post call. So you can see that when we made the post call that we got this response back with the title, the complete status, and also the ID. So we can actually write an assertion that's also going to check for that as well. So to do that, we can say and match and the response, because we want to take the HTTP response. We do double equals, and then we want to make sure that response equals a particular JSON blob. So the first thing that we want to check is that the response has an ID. And because this ID is basically just a randomly generated string, we're not going to be able to check on the exact string, the exact value of the string. What we do just want to check is that we just want to check that the response is an ID and that it is a string basically. So to do that, we can just use a special karate hash here, and we can just say that we want to make sure that the ID is of a string. Now for the other things like the title and the complete, we can actually be more specific because we know that the title is going to be first. We also know that the completes we're expecting to be false. So we can actually explicitly type those in instead. Okay, so I've got my title and my completes, and this is my JSON blob that we're getting back. Let's go ahead and run this again just to check that it's still working. And the test passes again. So let's just check that it is definitely still working. So if I was to change this ID, let's say that we were expecting a number instead of a string. We go ahead and run that again. And this time it fails. It fails because the ID wasn't a number. The ID was coming back as this string. So that's good. That means that that's working. Just going to change that back over to a string. Now, another thing that we can actually do here is we can actually capture some of the response that's coming back from this API call. So say in the next call, say that this call was creating a single to do. Let's say that we wanted to make a follow-up call to actually get a single to do. In order to make that get call, we need to grab this ID and we need to save that into a parameter. So let's see how we can do that. So to do that in karate, I can just do *def. I'm going to name my parameter ID, and then the ID is just going to come from the response. And then from that response, we're just going to want to get that ID. So basically the ID that comes from the response. So we could capture anything from the response here. We could also capture the title. So to do that, it would do response.title. We wanted to capture the status as well. We could just say response.complete. In karate, we can also print out these values as well, just to make sure that we're capturing them. So I'll just do *print, and let's say value of ID, put double quotes, say value of ID, and then print out the ID like that. We could do the same for the title and the status. I won't do it here. I'll just do it for the ID for now. Let's go ahead and run this again. So again, we'll do Maven clean test. But the test has passed successfully. If we take a look at the logs, where is it? We can see down here, the value of the ID equals this, which is the ID that came back from it's the ID that basically gets generated for that particular task. Okay, let me close that down. Let's go ahead now and make a second API call. So in this scenario, so far, we've only got just this one call here. This is one call here that's making the post request. Let's go ahead and add another scenario. So let's say get a single to do. For this one, we say given. We don't need to specify the URL because that's already included in the background. But what we do want to do is we want to pass in the path, i.e. that ID. So remember that if we're going to get a single to do, we want to call this URL, then we want to do another slash, and then with the ID of the URL that we want to get. That was what we saw in Postman previously. So to do that in Karate, I can just do given path ID, and then that ID, that's going to get appended up to the URL like here. So we'll say given path ID, we'll just do when method get, because we're just making a get call. Let's again check that the status is at 200. Let's do a match on the response as well, similarly to like we did above. Now this time when we're checking the ID, instead of just checking for a string, we can actually check for the actual ID because we've already got that saved in this ID parameter. So to do that, we can use hash, open brackets, and then we just put in the ID. So again, that's that ID coming from here, the one that we've already saved. We're going to check on that. We're going to match on that in our response just to check that it actually exists. We'll also check on the title as well. Again, that title should be as before. So the title will be first. And the complete status should still be false as well. That looks good. Let's save that. Let's go ahead and execute again. So again, I do Maven clean test and our test is passed successfully. So again, if you want to change that, I don't know, I could just add a few X's here onto that first, run the test again, and this time the test has failed, as we would expect because the title was wrong. Let's just change that back. So that's how you can put two different calls and you can actually capture something from one call, chain it onto the next one. So let's keep going. Let's do another call. This time we're going to create a second to do. So we're going to do another post call. So here what we did when we created this to do, we put our JSON, we put it just in line in the request like so. But what we could actually do is that we could just define the JSON separately and pass that in as a parameter. So let's take a look at how to do that now. So to define some JSON, I'm just going to do star-def to do equals, and we're going to do 3 double quotes just because I want to put a blob of JSON in here. So in that to do, I've just put this blob of JSON. So it's similar to before, but this time it's just got the title of second and the complete of false. I've also put in the proper double quotes for this JSON as well. So when we did it inline like here, Karate took care of the double quotes for us. But this time, because I'm putting it in these triple double quotes, I want to make sure that I have proper JSON, i.e. that I'm including the double quotes here. So now we can write our Karate test as before. So we're going to say given request. And again, instead of putting in a body like this, I can just put in this to do instead, because that's got our JSON for us. So I'll say given request to do. And another thing we can do here is we can add HTTP headers as well. So we don't strictly need them for this API just because it's quite generous in that we don't need to supply many headers, but it's quite common to need to supply HTTP headers, particularly when you're providing different content types like JSON and XML, etc. So if we wanted to add in a header, we can just say and header. Let's say our header was called content type, and a common content type, and the one that we're sending is application/JSON. So that's just a simple example of how to add headers in Karate. Okay, let's do when method post, and we'll check again that the status is at 200. And then let's just check in the response, let's just check this time that the title is equal to second. So to do that, we can just do and match response, just call the title of the response, and Karate takes care of all the formatting for us just to grab out the title from the response. We can just check that it's equal to second. Looks good. Let's go ahead and run this again. Okay, that looks good, and our test is passing. So that looks good. So now that we've created a few to-dos, let's make one more call to get all the to-dos again. So this time we don't need to provide any given because all that we need is the URL, and we've already included in that in the background. So we can skip this given. We can just say straight away when method get. So we're just making a get call to this URL. Let's again check that we get a 200 response back. And let's also just grab the JSON for the first task as well. So we say star-def first task, and we just take our response, and then we would expect our response to have quite a few different tasks in it. So I'm just going to take the one at 0. That's just going to be our first task. And now we can do some matches on that as well, just to check that that is what we expect. So we say match first task. Let's say the first task dot title. Let's make sure that it's equal to first. And also match the first task. First task dot completes. Let's check that that's equal to false. Okay, that looks good. Let's go ahead and run this one last time. And that looks good. We can see in the logs that we're making these API calls. We're getting all of this JSON back here. It's got all of our different tasks that we're creating. If I jump over to the application and refresh, you can see here now that we're populating it with lots of different tasks. So let's take a quick pause here. Then when we come back, we'll have a look at how we can add some other HTTP calls, i.e. to make the update and delete calls.